We're going to start with section 3-2, part 1, energy flow. This section is broken up into two parts, so here's part 1. The flow of energy through an ecosystem is one of the most important factors that determines the system's capability to sustain life. So this entire section is going to be on how energy moves throughout a food chain or a food web. We start at the bottom of the food chain or food web, which is the producers. But we have to remember that sunlight is going to be the main source of energy for all life on Earth. Without the sun goes away, nothing living on Earth will exist. So you have to remember that sunlight is the main source of energy for all life on Earth. Some organisms obtain energy from a source other than sunlight, and we'll talk about these later in the podcast, but the list is mineral water underground, oils out of hot springs, and undersea vents. And as you can see by looking at the pictures right here, you can see the energy pouring out of these particular areas. Another name for producers is called autotrophs, and this is more the scientific name. If we break up the word, auto is self, and troph means to feed. So an autotroph is a self-feeder, means they can make their own food. So autotrophs use energy from the environment, whether it's the sun or some of the examples that were on the previous slide, to fuel the assembly of simple organic compounds into complex molecules. Some examples of some autotrophs are going to be plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. Another word for cyanobacteria is blue-green algae. And blue-green algae is something that is extremely toxic and dangerous, and you will sometimes hear that they have closed Lions Beach or lakes in Madison because there has been too much of this cyanobacteria or blue-green algae in the water. Once again, it is toxic to people, and you will not be able to or should not swim in bodies of water that have blue-green algae. So once again, organisms that make their own food are also called producers. Producers is going to be the common term. Autotrophs is what we're going to use in biology. Energy from the sun. The best known autotrophs obtain energy through the process of photosynthesis. And I know that you have heard the term photosynthesis before. We break up the word. Photo means light, and synthesis means to make. So it's using light in order to make something. And in this case, light is the energy source that is going to help us convert certain inorganic compounds into organic compounds. So the definition of photosynthesis is the process by which light energy is used to convert, and I'm going to break down these particular parts of the equation. This means carbon dioxide. This is, of course, water. These are the reactants, or what's going into the chemical reaction. This is where we put our sun. Then our products are oxygen and glucose. So on the other side of the arrow, those are called our products. These two things, carbon dioxide and water, go into, or are the reactants with light energy. They give us oxygen and glucose. So once again, oxygen is added to, and carbon dioxide is removed from the Earth's atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. Once again, plants or algae add oxygen, and they take in carbon dioxide in order to make photosynthesis work. On land, plants are the main autotrophs. So remember, on land, plants are the main autotrophs. In fresh water and the upper layer of the ocean, algae are the main autotrophs. And in tidal flats, this is a mixture of fresh and salt water and salt marshes. Here we have the cyanobacteria. That would be the most common autotroph. On land, once again, it's plants, fresh water, and the ocean, the upper part of the ocean, it's going to be algae. And then tidal flats and salt marshes, you're going to have your cyanobacteria. Earlier, we talked about what if there wasn't light present. Well, if there is not light present, there's another type of chemical reaction that's going to take place in order to make food. And these types of autotrophs rely on energy within chemical bonds of inorganic molecules. Inorganic is non-living. So in this word means not, organic means living. So once again, inorganic molecules mean non-living. A common inorganic molecule is going to be table salt or sodium chloride. So chemosynthesis, chemo means chemical. Synthesize means to make. So chemosynthesis is the use of chemical energy to produce carbohydrates. And in photosynthesis, we talked about glucose. Well, glucose is a carbohydrate. So in chemosynthesis, once again, we are using chemical energy to make carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are an organic molecule. Bacteria represent a large portion of the living autotrophs. So bacteria is what is going to help fuel or be a result of the process of chemosynthesis. Now on to the consumers, and I know this term is familiar to you. The scientific term for consumers is the word heterotroph. So that's what we're going to use a lot in biology. These are organisms that rely on other organisms for their energy and food supply. So heterotrophs or consumers need to eat other things in order to obtain energy. They cannot make energy on their own. Examples of some consumers are animals, fungi, and some bacteria. So once again, heterotrophs are also called consumers. But in biology, you are going to hear us use the term heterotrophs more often than you'll hear us use the term consumer. There are 5 types of heterotrophs, and these should be familiar to you. The first is an herbivore, and an herbivore eats plants. Examples of an herbivore are cows, caterpillars, and deer. The second type of heterotroph is a carnivore. Carnivores eat animals. So an example of a carnivore are snakes, dogs, and owls. Third type are omnivores, and that's what we as humans are. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. And the examples are humans, bears, and crows. The fourth type is detritivores. This may be a new term for you. Detritivores feed on plant and animal remains and other dead matter. Examples of detritivores are mites, earthworms, snails, and crabs. And the last category or the last type of heterotrophs are decomposers. Decomposers break down organic matter, and examples of decomposers are going to be bacteria and fungi. Let's pull this all together, and we're going to talk about the feeding relationships amongst both the producers and the consumers. One thing that you have to remember is energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, and students get this wrong all the time. One direction starts from the sun. We said in the beginning of the podcast that all living things on earth get their energy from the sun. Or, we also said inorganic compounds, depending upon what it is. But without the sun, life will not exist. Then we move to the autotrophs, which are our producers. And then energy moves to the various heterotrophs, which once again are the consumers. So it goes from the sun to the producers and then to the consumers. And how does this process look? It's called a food chain. Energy stored by producers can be passed through an ecosystem along what is called a food chain. And the definition of a food chain is a series of steps which organisms transfer energy. And that's the key. We're talking about energy movement by eating and then being eaten. So once again, a food chain is the transfer of energy by eating or being eaten. And here is a very basic or simple example of a food chain. At the bottom of the food chain, you're going to have your producer, which in this case it's a land, so it's your grass. Notice the way the arrows move. The arrows move towards, or they move up towards the top. They do not move in the opposite direction. They move which way the energy moves. So the grass is giving energy to the antelope because the antelope is eating the grass. Next is of course, your antelope, which is your herbivore. And notice the energy or the way the arrow moves. The arrow moves towards the coyote because the antelope is giving its energy to the coyote, which is the carnivore. What I do not want to see you doing is moving your arrows in the other direction. Students get this confused all the time. They say the coyote eats the antelope eats the grass. That's not what we're talking about. Once again, we're talking about the movement of energy. Energy moves from the grass gives the antelope energy, and the antelope give the energy to the coyote. And here is another very simple, or more, I should say, I guess it's complex, aquatic food chain. You've got your algae on the bottom, then you move to the zooplankton, which give their energy to the fish, which give their energy to the squid, and finally, which give their energy to the shark. Once again, arrows don't move in the direction of who is eating whom. This is wrong. No, no, no. Arrows are moving this way, showing the flow of energy. If we put a lot of food chains together, we end up with what is called a food web. So a food web is a feeding relationship among various organisms in an ecosystem that form a network of complex interactions. So if you look at this more carefully, you have lots, once again, of food chains that make up your food web. So we start with the producers, move on to our herbivore, and then up to our very top carnivore. This would be the top carnivore because there's nothing that's going to eat the fox. If we start with the plant again and move through it, we go from the plant to the grasshopper, to the frog, and then possibly up to the owl. Once again, the owl is the top of the food chain. Energy is moving from the producers to the top consumers. And that's how a food chain works. Again, in a food web are lots of food chains put together. Last is an example of another type of food web. And on this particular type of food web, they have also added the decomposers on the very bottom. Once again, you've got your producers that move up to your herbivores, that move to your first level carnivores, and that move up to your top level carnivores. And this concludes podcast section 3-2, part 1.